So it's been a super long time since I did any sort of wrap up for anything, whether on my blog or otherwise, but today I'm going to do a wrap up of all the books I read in January. So I read a ridiculous amount of books in January. Why? I don't know. I ended up reading a lot and I'm pretty proud of that. So hopefully I can keep it up in February. I'm a lot busier in February than I was in January because I have school. But I'm trying to start a new habit of reading every night before I go to sleep. So hopefully that can help me improve my reading numbers. So the first book I read was The Idiot by Elif Batuman. And yes, the title is a reference to the Dostoevsky book, which I haven't read. And it's the title because the main character of the book, Celine, is really into Russian literature, and so is the author. I think this book is very largely semi-autobiographical, just by looking at the context. So basically what it's about is it's a very meandering book, told in a very stream of consciousness style, about a young woman going off to college at Harvard, and it basically is just her observations of life. If you like pretentious literary fiction, as I really like, and as I write, well, I'm trying to write, and you will like this book. And so the main thread of the book is kind of Celine's fascination with linguistics and also her Turkish heritage, and she gets into kind of a weird relationship with this guy named Ivan, or Ivan. I don't know if it's how to pronounce his name, because they said it wasn't pronounced Ivan and my friend said it was pronounced Ivan. I read this for my book club and I don't know, but Ivan is Hungarian, and he's much older than she is, and he's a TA in her Russian class, and they start exchanging emails because this takes place in the 90s, and this book is just an exploration of Celine getting to understand the world around her and writing very poetically and intellectually about everything. She was really relatable, and even though the book has very little plot, it was so readable. And I really was just addicted to reading this book. The next book I read was Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer. So I don't know why I read this like randomly, because I downloaded a bunch of really old books onto my Kindle here, and I had a bunch of Schopenhauer essay collections on here, and I've been wanting to read Schopenhauer for a while because I know like what his philosophy stuff is, but I never actually read it. So I felt like if I wanted to be able to speak intelligently about anything, I should read the people whose ideas I know from YouTube videos and like actually read it, you know? So Schopenhauer is kind of known for coming up with antinatalism, or at least articulating it in his essay, and that essay is in this book actually. And so on a tangent, this is not what the video is about, but on a tangent, I would not consider myself an antinatalist because I just find the position way too fatalistic. I think that the opportunity to exist, even with all of the pain that comes with that opportunity, is worth it, I guess, on a metaphysical level. The other thing is that at best it's a thought experiment, at most it's a thought experiment, because there is literally no way to actually meaningfully enforce antinatalism that would actually work without extreme authoritarianism, which is obviously not worth it. It's not worth it. So it's just a thing that I think about when I'm bored, not something I take awfully seriously. So yeah, so that's one of the essays. There's a lot of other essays. There's one essay where he literally just rants about how people are too loud and how annoying it is when they're disturbing his thinking, which I relate to, as when I'm filming this, there's always people yelling in the hallway. So yeah, and then there's also his infamous essay about women, which, to say the least, just made me wonder if Schopenhauer was here right now, what would he think about the fact that I read his essay? Like, would he be outraged that a woman was reading his work? Or because, well, basically the entire thing of the essay is clear that he's got a chip on his shoulder. It's basically about how women are annoying and talk too much and cannot think on the same intellectual level as men. Standard like incel stuff. But yeah, it's infamous for being ridiculously misogynistic. It was like misogynistic to a degree that was almost comical. So that essay is notorious. But yeah, I've read it, so fun. Next, I read The Demon in the Freezer by Richard Preston. As I said in my top books of 2022 video, I'm weirdly morbidly fascinated with deadly diseases, and so that led me to Richard Preston's work. And this book is an exploration of smallpox, anthrax, and the bioweapons threat. It was published way back in 2002 or something. 2002, yeah. So it's a bit outdated, but it really made me think about how alarming the idea of biological weapons is. So I think that the future of warfare is both biological weapons and cyber weapons, because both of those have incredible potential for destruction, and it makes me a little bit paranoid. Next, I read Stoner by John Williams. So this was another book that I read with my book club, and the other members of the book club seemed to like it a lot more than I did. I thought it was alright. It's basically about this man who lives a very unremarkable life, where pretty much everything seems to go wrong for him, from his marriage to his time as a professor at a university. Everything just seems to not go the way he plans. He has a very mediocre life and I just thought this book was so depressing. But the entire point of the book is that you don't have to have a great, perfect life in order to have a worthwhile life, which is a good message, and I did like that message. The end of the book was a bit comforting, because I always have the feeling that my life is just going to turn out to be so, like, underwhelming, I guess. I guess that's the feeling. Because when you're a kid, you always think, when you're a kid, you have everything open to you. Like, teachers always asking you, what are you going to be when you grow up? And you can say anything. You can say ridiculous things like, I'm going to be president. I'm going to be an astronaut. And you just know, you just have the idea that these options are open for you. But then as you get older, gradually reality starts to creep in, and you realize that you're probably not going to be an astronaut. Like, that's probably not going to happen. And then it's just kind of depressing. I never had, like, huge ambitions as a child, but I don't know. Like, I feel like life is underwhelming sometimes, and this book just underlined that for me. I guess that's why I didn't like it. It made me sad. But it also made me feel better in some ways. I also thought it was a little bit boring. The writing style it had some nice quotes, but the writing style was a bit dull at places. The next book I read is a self-help book called Deep Work by Cal Newport. So I got really into watching a lot of studying and organization and self-help videos on YouTube as I prepared for the spring semester and as I was in my New Year's resolution era. So I read this book by Cal Newport, which is basically about how to slow down and get your concentration and your attention span back by focusing your work into long chunks of what he calls deep work, where you are 100% focused and the most productive. And this is a strategy that I'm trying to implement myself, because I used to be able to focus for long periods of time and get into extreme focus, but I can't do that anymore. And so I'm trying to get that ability back. So this book was very inspiring for me, and I think that I'm going to apply these methods in the future. Next book I read was a poetry collection, which was The Rain in Portugal by Billy Collins. So we read some Billy Collins poems in my AP English literature class last year when I was in high school, and I really liked his poems because they weren't impenetrable like a lot of poetry is. It was very easy to understand and written in a very, like, nice way. Like, I enjoyed reading his poetry. So I had a goal of reading a Billy Collins poetry collection at some point, and so I have. I've been getting a little bit more into poetry recently, and that's one of my other kind of pseudo-reading goals for this year. So I really liked that poetry collection. It was quirky and fun. The next book that I read was The Enchiridion by Epictetus. So another one of my like official New Year's 2023 goals was to implement more principles of Stoicism into my life. So I've been trying to start by reading Stoic philosophy. And I don't know why I started with this. I think it was because it was the shortest. But it was very nice and very helpful. So it goes into a lot of how to live your life mindfully and without judgment of other people and accepting what happens. And I first came into a lot of the principles of Stoicism in like a mental health context. And since then, I have been using it a lot for self-improvement. And one of my main goals is to do this stuff. So, in fact, I have a copy of Meditations that I have to read. As you can see, this is a book that I'm planning to read in February, is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Probably the most famous of Stoicism books. And of course, my interest in Stoicism has led me to an interest in ancient Rome, which is another thing that's been consuming my YouTube feed for a bit. The next book I read was Fox 8 by George Saunders. So I did not like this book, just to put it out there. I really like George Saunders' short stories. His voice is so off-putting, but also unique and interesting at the same time. And so I found this book at the library because I went to the S section looking for some George Saunders books, and I found this one. Unfortunately, I didn't like it. It was from the perspective of a fox, which I usually get pissed off when I read animal perspective books because they always make it really cutesy and gimmicky and annoying, and this book was like that. It was also had the message of why are humans so needlessly cruel to animals, which has just been done a lot before, and this book didn't really add anything new. The next book that I read was a graphic novel, Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. Hopefully I pronounced her name decently. Yeah. So this is a memoir of her experience growing up in Iran during the Islamic Revolution, and I found this book to be very interesting, and once again, one of those books that made me rethink my entire perspective and outlook, and maybe, again, for a minute, stop taking for granted growing up in a stable country, because reading about her childhood and the way that all these awful things that were going on in her country, and the way that she, the graphic novel did a really good job of portraying how she reacted to these things as a child in a way that a child would react, and it made me think a lot about how grateful I am that I didn't have to go through these kind of things as a child, because, or even like ever, like I can't imagine having to be in such a situation, and it really expanded my perceptions of the world as well as my understanding of Iranian history, because I really don't know that much stuff. So this book was very good and I would recommend it. There's a sequel that I haven't read yet that I need to read at some point. The next book is gonna stand out on this list because it is not the sort of thing I usually read. So my mom found this book. The book, by the way, is The Makeup Test by Jenny L. Howe. So my mom found this book on sale at Target, and she got it for me and asked me to read it because she said I should read something more fun other than the books that I normally read. So I said, okay, I'll read this romance book. And I did. And so I wrote a review of it on my blog. I gave it 2 stars. But it's not a book that's up my alley. So, well, I mean, in a way it was. I liked that it focused on the romance between 2 graduate students, and was kind of like an enemies to lovers, like second chance romance thing. I don't know why I know the names for all these tropes. But yeah, so it's basically about this girl who was forced to TA the same class with her ex-boyfriend, and they were both studying for medieval literature PhDs. So, I mean, yeah, it was if I was going to read any romance, of course it would have to be this one, right? I didn't like the writing, and I didn't like the characters that much, so I didn't give it that good of a rating, but it was engaging, and I did have a good time reading it, though it's not the thing that I would read usually or in the future. The next book I read was Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. So this is one of those books that seemingly everybody but me had read, so I decided I ought to give it a read, especially because I had heard a lot that my favorite TV show, Mr. Robot, was heavily inspired by Fight Club. So, of course, I decided to read it eventually, now. But of course, because I knew that that Mr. Robot was inspired by it, I knew the twist from the first page. But, that aside, this book was I had very mixed feelings. So number one, the themes of the book, which was very much about disillusionment and nihilism and stuff like that, are themes that I have intended to and have explored in my own fiction creative writing pursuits. So reading this book was kind of give me some ideas for different themes that different ways to further develop these themes in one of the novels that I was trying to write, which I started like in the fall, which is currently on pause right now. But I didn't like the writing style though. It was very confusing. It was written in kind of like an experimental way, and it worked in the beginning, but it soon became very annoying. The amount of times I read, the first rule of Fight Club is that you don't talk about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. Like, okay, we get it. You can say the phrase once, you know, it's a good sentence, right? But you can't like repeat it every single time. And I just thought it was okay. It was an okay book. I was a little underwhelmed, but I thought it was pretty good. Just, it's one of those books where it's kind of like, I understand why people like it. It wasn't my favorite book of all time, though. And finally, the last book that I read this month was Animal Farm by George Orwell. Again, I reread it, and I read it in French this time, actually. But I've read Animal Farm 3 times, and reading it the 3rd time gave me a lot of new insights that I didn't understand the first 2 times I read it when I was 15. So I wrote a longer review on my blog, and I'm probably going to talk about Animal Farm in another video, which is why I'm not talking about it that much here. I'm probably gonna reread 1984 and then do a video about 1984 and Animal Farm together or something. Maybe. I don't know. I'll see.